Let's face it, B2B sales is in trouble. Blast emails, cold calling and irrelevant messages, not to mention an economy causing uncertainty to spike, is creating a canyon-sized divide between buyers and sellers alike. The answer? Deep sales. Today, organizations that adopt deep sales strategies and technologies are setting themselves up for long-term success with an approach that sets their sellers up to be seen as trusted, strategic advisors by the buyers they serve. We at the world's largest professional network are sitting down with some of the most innovative sales voices today to discuss what it means to bring deep sales into an enterprise organization. Let's dive in with our host, Rob Humphrey.
Ayal Steinberg is IBM's General Manager for Technology Product Sales. He's had experience at Oracle, DataStax, and other tech companies. He's one of the top sales leaders in the world. We get to talk to him on this episode of the Deep Sales Podcast.
So I'm a big fan of deep sales, and I think you guys are putting into a bottle or a container a lot of principles and concepts that I'm really kind of driving and steering. Everything from marketing and sales working closer together, right, as like a source of those client interests, and then making it actionable, right? Because I think there's one thing just knowing what's happening, but what do you act on it? How do you actually do that? And how do you take signals and drive them into better outcomes for sellers?
It's so good to be live. We're here with Ayal Steinberg, who's IBM's General Manager for Technology Product Sales. Thanks for joining, Ayal. How are you doing today?
Rob, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. So we're going to talk sales. We're going to talk deep sales. We're going to talk about you. But before we get going, let's do some, I know you got a little bit of a music background, so let's do a little bit of test here. And we'll start by choosing between the Rolling Stones or the Beatles. Who are you going to pick?
I'm going to go with the Beatles. I want to just jump in because I think anybody who's watching this has probably got to state the obvious that both of us actually go to the same hairstylist. So I think we should just call that out before people kind of bring it on to us. But it's nice to meet another fellow person who's got the same hairstyle. My father used to have a saying that grass doesn't grow in a busy field. And I think, I don't know if that applies to you or not.
Indeed. In the amount of just sort of resources that we don't use, having this level of hairstyle is really something that we should underscore. I think we should really underscore that in the podcast as we go along. But
definitely. Sorry to take your music question off. The Beatles between those two, but I felt like I had to say it.
Yeah. So let me hit you with something a little deeper. Notorious B.I.G. Tupac.
Oh my goodness, I'm East Coast. You know, I love this was probably right when I was in high school, so like a pretty prime time of like really falling in love with music, and I always really had an appreciation for Biggie at the time. Over time, I've kind of learned more about the West Coast and Tupac and Suge Knight and all that scene, but I will definitely go Biggie over Tupac if you ask me to choose between the two.
If you really delve into their discography and the last sort of like probably like 5 or 6 songs, it's really fascinating how intertwined these two really are. It's, you know, despite all the sort of problematic pieces in the earlier days. Anyway, good. Thank you for indulging on that. So look, you've worked in your career. You've done a lot of interesting things. Binghamton University. You worked at Macy's and strategic planning. What did all this early career stuff teach you, or did it actually inform your current sort of way of leading sales?
Yeah, I feel really blessed to have had the background that I've had, and I wouldn't have changed one thing. And I think, there's a concept, I think, built around a movie that was released a couple of years ago called Sliding Doors. And the whole idea is that, I think there's 2 runs in the movie. Like, one is if they make the train, they put their hand in the door opens, and there's a whole series of things that happen. The other one is they put their hand in, but it doesn't close, and there's a whole series of things that happen. And you don't really know what's going to happen when it does. I view my career a little bit like that, is that, I was pretty unintentional, right? I was an economics major in Binghamton, and I kind of found my way to Binghamton largely because my good buddy was there and he was having a great time, and it just thought it was the right thing to do. I was just thinking about this in the last week, now that a lot of people are thinking about what colleges are they going to go to, and I have a neighbor
Yeah.
who's been really thoughtful about it. I just happened to stumble into Binghamton. My first day of class was my first day visiting. It was really unintentional. I thought I was going to go into finance, and I ended up going into music first, Geffen Records for a short period of time, but then into retail, into Lord & Taylor and Macy's. And, what I found in those times, it was the late 90s, was that companies were just figuring out the value of data and analytics. And I remember in Macy's and Lord & Taylor opening a new store in Puerto Rico. And the challenge was with a new store in a new market is you don't really know what fashion to put there and how much do you have to put there. And there's a little bit of this balance between art and science. And I remember how fascinating it was to be able to have a unique perspective, to not just do what everybody's been doing, but think about a problem because it was a new problem for the company, and then how to approach that. And you really can find that there's this marriage, right? A marriage potential of using data and insights to better inform the decisions that's really kind of native to people's gut and that comes with experience. And like once that clicked for me, that business is this marriage of data and science and, art and math or whatever you kind of want to look at the two balances, that really set me in the direction of getting into enterprise software and technology. But everything was grounded at that time, right? So that's a big kind of impact on how a random set of activities, but really kind of foundational to what I'm doing now.
Yeah, it sounds like you really paid attention when you were in school and stuff and like really were thoughtful. That's awesome.
I don't know about that. I was the kid that that didn't show up to every class, but knew when the tests were, and I kind of figured out what I needed to know for that test. I don't know if I was necessarily a good, thoughtful student, but I figured out what the real objective was, and I figured out the minimum amount of work to get through that.
So look, you've worked at IBM's division that essentially markets AI, right? So obviously you have an opinion on this. You have a newsletter on LinkedIn called Selling with Data. I got to go to the back issues and do some reading there. I haven't read them all, but pretty great stuff. And turns out you could write. So what has changed? Let me ask you this. How has data changed selling? How has data changed selling?
I think first, data has changed everywhere, right? Data, and then the analytics on top of the data has changed every single industry, right? And every function. I actually think sales is a little bit of a laggard compared to some other areas, right? Like finance, HR, right? How do you hire people? How do you kind of filter people? Marketing around like how do you address like your ideal customer profile? And then how do you target that person and using cadences? And then like the actual art of selling is largely based on a really strong individual contributor who's got some skills that can go out and listen and ask good discovery questions and progress and kind of navigate a relationship to be able to get to ultimately the decision maker and then give them a convincing pitch or argument or economic business case to get them to be compelled to actually make a purchase, right? That's been the art form. So data itself has become much more readily available, right? It's much more available, especially in the last 3-4 years where every click, every download, every interaction is now captured and codified somewhere within your system. And it really becomes like almost what I would call an IQ test of, do sellers want to use that information and get an advantage, or do they just want to rely on what they've been doing for the last 20 years, which I don't think has been working as effectively as what they as it was 20 years ago.
So Ayal, listen, look, let's talk about deep sales a little bit. At LinkedIn, we talk about the concept of deep sales, and it's basically the emphasis of technology to gain insights on prospects and customers, to be more effective, essentially, to, serve the customers better. I want to get your take on the approach, and in particular, the idea of up-leveling sellers on shifting them along the performance curve. What's your best thinking on deep sales?
So I'm a big fan of deep sales, and I think you guys are putting into a bottle or a container a lot of principles and concepts that I'm really kind of driving and steering. Everything from marketing and sales working closer together, right, as like a source of those client interests, and then making it actionable, right? Because I think there's one thing just knowing what's happening, but what do you act on it? How do you actually do that? And how do you take signals and drive them into better outcomes for sellers? So we could kind of unpack it as you go, but I think generally huge fan of it. I think it's the future, and I think if people aren't on board, they are going to be left behind.
What I want to know is, like, in your job, in your organization, are you looking at different skill sets when you're hiring salespeople? And how are you implementing training to sort of up level the team as it is now?
Sure. So I one of the biggest things that I look for, biggest attributes, is curiosity. What I mean by curiosity is just the natural, innate DNA for a person if they want to dig a little bit deeper to understand the why. Why is this happening? Why do you say that? Like, this doesn't make sense to me. Teach me more. That's probably the number one thing that I look for. I look for tenacity. Like, is a person hardworking, and do they give up, or do they kind of stick it through and find the outcome? Those are really like the two major things that I look for. When it comes to like deep selling, and even just embracing this idea of using data and analytics to make better decisions, I find that like sellers is kind of new to them, right? And there are a few that have picked up on it, but I don't use it as a criteria. I do think that if somebody hasn't done it before, it doesn't stop them or limit their ability to use things like deep insights and deep sales to be able to take their own skills and experiences to the next level. So I don't filter out on like, hey, do you use deep sales, or do you not? Do you use insights? Do you use technology? I think it's a multiplier, right? What I'm looking for is someone who knows how to communicate, is curious, is hardworking, and then you could layer on top of these other tools and tricks and skills to take them to the next level.
Yeah, for sure. One thing that I've noticed, I'm a seller, obviously, is that, people are trying to get deeper into accounts, specifically using data to identify buyers that are most likely to engage, but also like people that are just in the periphery. In other words, you can't just go call the CMO and the VP. You've got to create sort of this allied front. You've got to create a lot of people that are in your corner. How do you create this habit amongst your team? And what are your strategies there?
If I could comment on what you said a little bit, Rob, because I think it makes a lot of sense. I think there's a few shifts that have happened. Like, one is just there's more information available for sellers, right?
Yeah.
These digital touch points, all these things that have happened largely comes in from marketing. You got other things that are coming in from product, like how people are clicking on the product, how are they using it, how far do they go? Like, are they coming back every day, once every 7 days? Like, all of that information is new for sellers. You got support tickets and other things that might signal things. Like, some of that's been around for a while, but a lot of that is really new. So part of that kind of gets to your technology and data part of the deep insights. And then you really have to drive to the insights themselves. And, I used to think, like, as a good example for sellers to say, like, what would you prefer? Would you prefer one person at your customer who just did 10 different activities, a white paper download, they came to an event, they did a trial, all of that stuff? Or would you prefer 10 different people from the same customer who just did the exact one thing, downloaded the same white paper? And I think historically, people would really put a lot of value in the most CRM systems or even MQL systems on the one person who did 10 things. That seems like a home run and like a hot lead and go after that person. But they might be the wrong person in your organization because they might have no buying authority. They might just be kicking tires because they're themselves looking to leave the company and they just want to learn a new skill.
Yes.
When you get 10 people in the same company, chances are there's somebody that in that company has said, we got to do this because we got this big problem. And then somebody leaves and says, I think I found an answer, check this out. And he sends it to 10 different people in the company and they all click on the white paper download and they all download the trial and they chase after it. All of a sudden you get these 10 signals, which by themselves maybe aren't that impactful. But if I'm a seller and I almost look at it like an escape room of these clues, like what's the relationship between them? Who is the senior person? Do I go to the senior person? Do I go to multiple junior people to figure out what just happened so that I can put it all together to get a level of customer intimacy that when I'm approaching them with a problem or with a solution that they're actually, I know that it's a warm lead that they're already interested in it, right? That I think is the difference. It's not just expecting the customer to go through the whole journey, but it's being able to use clues that are now available to you to be better informed of how you should actually identify and kind of start working with the customer.
Yeah, it's really refreshing to hear you say this because I get it. And I really like the way when you first said 1 or 10, I'm like, yeah, well, the 10, because well, now I could kind of really be more scientific. And I also agree, like, and I'm seeing this as well, like the top reps that are in tech in particular selling, like they're going really deep because there's so much more indecision now, and I think you'd agree, like it's harder for people to make decisions, and it's taking a longer time. The sales cycles are definitely not getting shorter as far as I could tell. So
No, for
having
sure.
that sort of, having that sort of swath. So, and let's talk about that. Look, the buying journey is changing. It's changing sales organizations. And I'm kind of curious, like, have you seen changes or, effective changes to sales organizations in your role where you're looking at a lot of different,
For sure. So I have a unique opportunity to see a pretty broad playing field, and I see it across a lot of different routes to market, right? I see it through direct face-to-face sellers. I see it through ecosystem partners. I see it through a digital kind of PLG type motion, and I see it all coming together. What gets really interesting when you have the view of the different routes is that it's not just like a customer will pick one route. Like you could have your biggest customer that's spending your most amount of revenue for you, or biggest achievement that's producing your most sales. But you might have people within that company who now want to choose a different route, a digital route or ecosystem route for something else.
Yeah.
And they might not even be connected. Like think about your own company. If you got more than a couple dozen people, there's probably people who are doing things that you have no idea what they're doing. Like historically, most things went through a single source of like a sourcing person or someone who would bring together all of the demand. And then they would say, okay, I can see enough pockets of demand across these different groups, finance, HR, marketing, they all want your stuff. Let me figure out how I aggregate it out and I can figure out who's going to fund the bucket. Now you got self-service and you got people within these different pockets who are researching themselves, and they might not even know that the person down the hall from them in the same company is interested in the same thing. So the seller used to be about trading their access for information, right? Customer wants to know what your supply chain system does, your sourcing system, whatever it is, right? Hey, come in and talk to me. Fine, I have no problem talking to you, but let me ask you a few questions and I'll give you the information. Customer would tolerate it, right? Now all that information is on the web. So now it's not, what is the value that a seller is going to provide? It's, hey, let me teach you something about your own organization. Did you know these 10 different groups are actually all accessing with this data science product? And did you know that this person's really far along in the process and they actually have been buying it and 20 other people have been buying it too, and we're starting to see that uptick? Like, let's talk about that, right? That is the beginning of the sales engagement. And how do you go from like these tactical one-off little purchases to a real strong strategic relationship and conversation with an executive at your customer, because you're talking about the business value based on information that's actually about their company that they probably don't know, but you as a seller know, right? It changes the whole paradigm and arms sellers with a reason to call other than, here's what my product does, it's amazing, we'll save all this money. It's like, hey, let me show you something or teach you something about your own organization that you might not actually know about.
Do you think though, like, I mean, the modern seller, do you think this idea of this multi-threading is a good thing, or is it making it harder? Like, what's your theory on that? Because it definitely takes a multi-threading, in my opinion, aspect to be a top rep.
Yeah, I think sellers fall into three categories. And, the splits, it doesn't really matter, but I think there's three. Let's call it a third, a third, a third. There's a third that absolutely gets it. And they're waking up every morning and they're saying, I got a peer on a different company who's competing with me. And if I have something that will give me a competitive advantage to be even more relevant, I'll do it. Because everybody's using the same tools. Everybody's using a version of Outreach or SalesLoft. Everybody's using even the information, like you said, on LinkedIn Sales Navigator. Like, everybody's got access to the same information. It's about, what do you do? And I think that third of the sellers who get that and say, though everybody has access to it, not everybody's using it. And if I could figure out how to not just use it, but use it in a way that differentiates me and actually provides value to my customer and separates them, that group does really, really well. There's the middle group of sellers who are watching that first group and saying, like, I'm not exactly sure. It sounds like a lot of work. Like, I'm pretty convicted in what I've been doing. Like, you know what? I've had a great run. I think I read one of your thing. You had 40 quarters in a row, right? Your interview on how I sell, which I thought was really great. 40 quarters in a row of success. Is that seller really going to stop and say, I should do things differently? I think they're in a more like, let me wait and see. And I think that group is really heavily influenced by their first line manager. If their first line manager lets them be, they're probably going to let them be. If they're all of a sudden asking them to do different things, I think they can move over. There's a final third of the selling team that I'm convinced that if I put world peace into a package and said, just open it and we will achieve world peace, they won't even open anything new, right? They won't open the package to achieve world peace. And that team, like, that's that group, right? Whatever they are doing, if they're achieving, then great. No, it doesn't have to be for everybody, right? If they're relationship sellers or true challenger sellers, or if they just have a secret sauce about how they approach things that doesn't depend on technology and insights, like, great. What I find is in that third group, you got a lot of bottom performers, right? Because they don't have growth mindsets. They're pretty fixed in what they do and how they do things. And they're the ones who aren't showing up to enablement. Those are the ones that aren't curious. And unfortunately, when you get a big organization, you're going to have people like that. I wish them all the best of luck. But I also believe that a good seller should be a participant in their own rescue. And if they want to achieve like you have achieved, they got to invest in their skills and contemporize or modernize the way they go to market, right? I think they owe it to their customers.
So how are you going about, in your organization, how are you going about arming people to sort of give them the tools or to sort of maybe upgrade them into that first swath?
Great.
What do you
Great question. Yeah, great question. I think I'm in year 3 of this journey right now. The first year, I would talk to like the Forresters and the Serious Decisions and McKinsey's and the BCGs. And part of being in my position that I get access to those people, which is great, right? And it really helps you kind of fine tune on what we should do. I feel like in the first year, we kind of nailed that down. Probably not perfect, but enough. The second year, I started going to, well, how do we get everybody to use it? And you start talking to change management folks and psychologists and sociologists, and you get into like the herd mentality and what does it take for people who actually are going to change? And change is hard, right? I totally get it. There's a great quote that I heard from a customer once. Kaiser Permanente was on stage talking about something, and they said that people don't move when they see the light, they move when they feel the heat, right? I love that. And that means that, like, listen, I use the analogy. Everybody knows that high efficiency light bulbs will save you money compared to regular light bulbs. But very few people go out and replace all the light bulbs in your house because you got to get a ladder out. You got to do all this stuff just to get the value proposition. It's not until that you have like an urgency that you're actually going to change your behavior, right? And I think that's a big part of this is that if sellers are doing really well, like you were doing really well, then you're probably not going to be open for new changes and doing something new. But I think even like you said, and I appreciate your vulnerability in your article where you talked about what you learned in the last 3 quarters of not making it and how you really learn who your friends are, like that was really powerful, right? And I think all of a sudden you become more humble and you're actually willing to be coachable and you start embracing things that might actually get you to the sustained another 40-year run or 40-quarter run in front of you. I think it's a little bit of people like feeling that they can't just stay on the course they're on. The pain of not changing has to exceed the pain of changing. And that's when magic happens.
That's really an excellent summary. It's like, I totally get that. I was really thinking through, listening and thinking through what that means for like, even like my career or, people that are new, for example. I see a lot of new people come into sales, and it's sort of like an interesting world, right? Because they're not necessarily out there packing the pavement. They're kind of like figuring out how to do all this stuff digitally in a lot of ways. And it's a different selling environment. Question for you on this whole, generative AI piece. I want to get back to that because I know you have a lot of depth here, and definitely want to, start tuning into your newsletter a little bit more frequently. But, these tools, are they going to make our life easier? Are they going to make it more complex? What's your thinking, like sort of bring me into the future of generative AI in particular plus sales? What does it look like?
So this is such a fast moving part of the market. And I just want to reinforce, like, these are my opinions, right? I think, the company that I work for is IBM, and IBM has a point of view, but let me give you kind of my view, if that's okay with that disclaimer or caveat on
it.
I think generally anything like this is good, right? And I think there's always this fear, like, somebody posted about the WordPress and like it took what was handwritten books and then put it on the thing and all of a sudden multiplied, and everybody's like, holy cow, like what happens when the common person starts reading, they're going to get educated, they're going to revolt against the government. There's this like fear, right? And everybody locked it down. I think in a way there's a similar fear of a lot of potentially unknowns of what could happen. I think generally these are really positive things, right? In a way, this is not much different than when robots came into the manufacturing plants, and you get more consistency. And like, sure, it really hurt the people who were in the plants who were doing that work. But a lot of them in Detroit and other places around the world, they upgraded and they took on different jobs that didn't require that same amount of work or that level of work. They started becoming knowledge workers or whatever else, right? And I think we've historically have seen a shift of people who work with their hands that were replaced by automation. And now I think we're seeing a shift to knowledge workers. And I think generally it's good, right? We're gonna see faster, better, really amazing outcomes. And what really excites me is we're going to start doing things that we can't even imagine today of being a problem. Just like 10 years ago, we couldn't think of the things that are happening now being a problem around the internet and Airbnb and, Uber. And these are all things of value that are locked up that all the technology is doing is unlocking it. It's not creating, the unused space in people's homes was always there. The back of people's car was always there. The connection of getting value out of that is what's new. So when you look at the world today, there's so many potential areas of unlocked value that technology and AI is now have the opportunity to unlock that. And it's going to become so obvious when it comes unlocked, but just like being an Airbnb before we did it, like you just didn't see it until it is there. And I think that's the way to look at cognitive AI and AI in general.
That's a really excellent summary of that. I think a lot of people get tweaked up about that question because they're like, I don't know, it's going to be like, it's not about taking people's jobs or being less efficient or more efficient. It's about sort of there are these sort of unlocking opportunities. So no, I appreciate your insights on it for sure. What do you think in a nutshell, the top rep over there, what are they doing differently, do you think?
So I'm going to say the top rep on a continuous basis, because I think there are some really, really talented reps who find themselves in a really unique, special situation that really crush it 1 year and 2 years, and they earn everything. They deserve everything that they get. And I see some really high commission payouts for those folks, and I love seeing it, right? The more that people make money, the better that we're all off. I'm going to answer your question on not the people who just hit the grand slams every 5 years, but what about the people that hit the home runs continuously year in, year out? Okay. And I'm not going to say every single year, because I think to your point is that not everybody, the sun's not going to shine every single day, but I think continuously, let's say 8 out of 10 years in a row. What I find about them is that kind of like the challenger seller, right? That having a point of view and actually knowing where to spend your time. Like, I don't get upset when sellers are, let's call it lazy, right? In a way, when I think about, I have a group of people and I want to get the highest productivity out of those people, that if somebody can get to blowing out their quota with a little amount of work, but doing consistently, like that's okay with me, right? I actually don't penalize a seller for finding the least path to a good deal, good quality deal, because I think that's okay. That's part of the game. Like, some people have to grind and some people it comes easier. The people who are exceptional are selective about where they spend their time. They come in with a point of view. They're somewhat technical. They get their hands dirty or they get dirt in their fingernails. And they're really laser focused on not the customer, but the customer's customer, right? And I find that like some of the best sellers that I could think of don't start coming into a relationship with how can I sell the biggest deal? They say, how can I solve the biggest problem? And those are the sellers that include services and get technical sellers engaged early, shoulder to shoulder, as opposed to nose to nose, right? Let me work with you to understand what it is you're trying to achieve. Why can't you create that outcome? And then let's invest together so I can show you in this MVP that I got skin in this game too, and I could actually help you in a way to achieve it. And then once there's this true, like authentic value add that's based on the customer achieving their outcome, then, that's when beautiful things happen. I think the sellers that know that aren't just looking for an empty calorie deal or like a one hit and then kind of bolts, the people who are looking at it for the long term and really helping the customer, those are exceptional sellers that tend to really rise to the top.
I have a lot of thoughts. I want to underscore the point you make about like look, if you're selling to a hospital, it's really about the patients, right? I just had knee surgery. I wasn't worried about the person selling. It's one step removed from where you're normally thinking. If you're selling in higher education, there's students that are involved and their parents and people who have jobs who are investing, employers that are reimbursing them. It's very complex when you think through. So I want to underscore that. I think that's a secret that most people don't get.
The other side of it too is that like figuring out what's important for a company is not hard. And this clicked on me a couple of years ago, actually, that when there was a Sandler coaching person who was talking through, and he shared that he said, because public companies, you can't give an advantage to a certain group of bankers or investment folks. You have to be kind of that whatever information you put out there, you have to put it out there to everybody. So they put that information out, what their strategy is, what's important, how they're going to differentiate from the competition, where they're going to invest. They put that into annual reports and 10Ks and other public information. They have to. They can't just put out a general thing to some people or to the market and then whisper to other people. So if you're a seller, this is super simple, become a shareholder, right? Buy a few pieces of stock or equity. It's pretty small to get started to do it. And you'll be invited to these communications and you will know from the top of the organization what is important to that. Read the annual report, right? There's nothing in there that isn't hard to get to if you spend the time. And I find that the sellers who get that, to your point about the hospital who thinks about the patient, if I could look up and see that a hospital's got an initiative around reducing readmission, right? So they are getting hit that people who they admit in, if they come back within 7 days or 30 days, it's a big black mark for them, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, if I know that, how can I help reduce the level of readmission? That's a really high leverage problem that's going to make somebody on the hospital side really kind of stand up and do attention. What the technology is that embraces is not that important. It's the outcome of how do you drive to that board level initiative.
Ayal, I want to thank you for joining the Deep Sales Podcast. It's been an incredible episode. I could talk to you for hours. I actually hope to do that sometime. We've covered off on how technology is impacting sales, how the buyer and decision-making process is changing, and some interesting thoughts you have on the stratification of sales professionals and their performance. So really appreciate you being on.
Rob, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I had a lot of fun.
Thank you for joining the Deep Sales Podcast. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and share. See you on our next episode. Or for more deep sales insights in the meantime, check out the LinkedIn Sales blog. As always, happy selling.